Flying into Australia, I realized with a sigh that I had forgotten again who their Prime Minister is. I'm forever doing this with the Australian Prime Minister, committing the name to memory, forgetting it, generally more or less instantly, then feeling terribly guilty. My thinking is that there ought to be one person outside Australia who knows. But then Australia is such a difficult country to keep track of. On my first visit, some years ago, I passed the time on the long flight reading a history of Australian politics in the 20th century, wherein I encountered the startling fact that in 1967 the Prime Minister, Harold Holt, was strolling along a beach in Victoria when he plunged into the surf and vanished. No trace of the poor man was ever seen again. This seemed doubly astounding to me. First, that Australia could just lose a Prime Minister. I mean, come on. And second, that news of this had never reached me. The fact, of course, we pay shamefully scant attention to our dear cousins down under. Not entirely without reason, of course. Australia is, after all, mostly empty and a long way away. Its population, just over 18 million, is small by world standards. China grows by a larger amount each year. And its place in the world economy is consequently peripheral. As an economic entity, it ranks about level with Illinois. Its sports are of little interest to us, and the last television series it made that we watched with avidity was Skippy. From time to time, it sends us useful things. Opals, merino wool, Errol Flynn, the boomerang, but nothing we can't actually do without. Above all, Australia doesn't misbehave. It is stable and peaceful and good. It doesn't have coups, recklessly overfish, armed disagreeable despots, grow coca in provocative quantities, or throw its weight around in a brash and unseemly manner. But even allowing for all this, our neglect of Australian affairs is curious. Australians can't bear it that we pay so little attention to them, and I don't blame them. This is a country where interesting things happen, and all the time. Consider just one of those stories that did make it into the Times in 1997, though buried away in the odd sock drawer of Section C. In January of that year, according to a report written in America by a Times reporter, scientists were seriously investigating the possibility that a serious seismic disturbance in the remote Australian outback almost 4 years earlier had been a nuclear explosion set off by members of the Japanese doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo. It happens that at 11:03 p.m. local time on May 28, 1993, seismograph needles all over the Pacific region twitched and scribbled in response to a very large-scale disturbance near a place called Banjawarn Station in the Great Victoria Desert of Western Australia. Some long-distance truckers and prospectors, virtually the only people out in that lonely expanse, reported seeing a sudden flash in the sky and hearing or feeling the boom of a mighty but far-off explosion. One reported that a can of beer had danced off the table in his tent. The problem was that there was no obvious explanation. The seismograph traces didn't fit the profile for an earthquake or mining explosion, and anyway the blast was 170 times more powerful than the most powerful mining explosion ever recorded in Western Australia. The shock was consistent with a large meteorite strike, but the impact would have blown a crater hundreds of feet in circumference, and no such crater could be found. The upshot is that scientists puzzled over the incident for a day or two, then filed it away as an unexplained curiosity, the sort of thing that presumably happens from time to time. Then in 1995, Aum Shinrikyo gained sudden notoriety when it released extravagant quantities of the nerve gas sarin into the Tokyo subway system, killing 12 people. In the investigations that followed, it emerged that Aum's substantial holdings included a 500,000-acre desert property in Western Australia, very near the site of the mystery event. There, authorities found a laboratory of unusual sophistication and focus, and evidence that cult members had been mining uranium. It separately emerged that Aum had recruited into its ranks 2 nuclear engineers from the former Soviet Union. The group's avowed aim was the destruction of the world, and it appears that the event in the desert may have been a dry run for blowing up Tokyo. You take my point, of course. This is a country that loses a prime minister, and that is so vast and empty that a band of amateur enthusiasts could conceivably set off the world's first non-governmental atomic bomb on its mainland, and almost 4 years would pass before anyone noticed. Clearly, this is a place worth getting to know. And so, because we know so little about it, perhaps a few facts would be in order. Australia is the world's 6th largest country and its largest island. It is the only island that is also a continent, and the only continent that is also a country. It was the first continent conquered from the sea, and the last. It is the only nation that began as a prison. It is the home of the largest living thing on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef, and of the largest monolith, Ayers Rock, or Uluru, to use its now official, more respectful Aboriginal name. It has more things that will kill you than anywhere else. Of the world's 10 most poisonous snakes, all are Australian. 5 of its creatures, the funnel-web spider, box jellyfish, blue-ringed octopus, paralysis tick, and stonefish, are the most lethal of their type in the world. This is a country where even the fluffiest of caterpillars can lay you out with a toxic nip, where seashells will not just sting you but actually sometimes go for you. Pick up an innocuous cone shell from a Queensland beach, as innocent tourists are all too wont to do, and you will discover that the little fellow inside is not just astoundingly swift and testy, but exceedingly venomous. If you are not stung or pronged to death in some unexpected manner, you may be fatally chomped by sharks or crocodiles, or carried helplessly out to sea by irresistible currents, or left to stagger to an unhappy death in the baking outback. It's a tough place. And it is old. For 60 million years, since the formation of the Great Dividing Range, the low but deeply fetching mountains that run down its eastern flank, Australia has been all but silent geologically. In consequence, things, once created, have tended just to lie there. So, many of the oldest things ever found on Earth, the most ancient rocks and fossils, the earliest animal tracks and riverbeds, the first faint signs of life itself, have come from Australia. At some undetermined point in the great immensity of its past, perhaps 45,000 years ago, perhaps 60,000, but certainly before there were modern humans in the Americas or Europe, it was quietly invaded by a deeply inscrutable people, the Aborigines, who have no clearly evident racial or linguistic kinship to their neighbors in the region, and whose presence in Australia can only be explained by positing that they invented and mastered ocean-going craft at least 30,000 years in advance of anyone else, in order to undertake an exodus, then forgot or abandoned nearly all that they had learnt, and scarcely ever bothered with the open sea again. It is an accomplishment so singular and extraordinary, so uncomfortable with scrutiny, that most histories breeze over it in a paragraph or two, then move on to the second, more explicable invasion, the one that begins with the arrival of Captain James Cook and his dowdy little ship HMS Endeavour in Botany Bay in 1770.